I spent 11 grueling years working search and rescue operations across the jagged, unforgiving ridges of western North Carolina before my knees finally deteriorated and forced me into retirement. I am providing that specific context upfront because throughout my entire life, I have only ever shared this account twice. On both occasions, the listeners immediately dismissed me, claiming I was either fabricating the entire ordeal or suffering from some profound psychological delusion. I am utterly exhausted by that reaction. I am laying this out here simply to let it exist, a matter of record untouched by the skepticism of people who have never stood in the deep, dark spaces of the world. The call came down in the bleak, fading days of late October. A seasoned hunter had gone missing. He was more than 3 days overdue from his scheduled check-in with his wife. This wasn't a reckless amateur. He was an older local who had navigated these specific mountains since childhood. He was entirely UN-prone to getting disoriented. Our assigned search grid was the treacherous western slope of a massive, unnamed ridge. The terrain there is nightmarish, dense, ancient hardwood forests that suddenly plummet into suffocating laurel hells along the low creek drainages. If you have never experienced a laurel hell, it is a dense, tangled matrix of mountain laurel and rhododendron so thick it blocks out the sun. You can wander a mere 50 feet off an established trail, and it will take you a agonizing hour of crawling, hacking, and bleeding just to fight your way back. We deployed using standard protocol, splitting into teams of 3 to systematically grid the treacherous zone. The process is slow, exhausting, and psychologically draining. You take a few deliberate steps through the brush, stop, and call out the missing person's name into the vast, absorbing silence, waiting for an echo that never comes. My team consisted of myself and 2 fellow volunteers. One was a highly capable woman I will refer to as Dee, and the other was a veteran tracker whose name I will omit out of respect, as he remains an active operative within the county. We were assigned the low-altitude drainage, the absolute worst of the thicket. For 4 continuous hours, we were bent entirely double, dragging our packs through the interlocking roots and gnarled branches of the laurel. By late afternoon, the autumn light began to change, turning a heavy, ominous shade of bruised orange as it filtered through the dying canopy. Suddenly, the claustrophobic wall of brush relented, and we spilled out onto a small, unexpected bench of flat ground positioned right beside a rushing creek. It was a natural clearing, and we stopped dead in our tracks to catch our breath and regroup. Dee noticed at first. She froze mid-step, extending her arms slowly to bar me from moving forward. She didn't utter a single sound. She just pointed through the dimming orange light. On the far side of the clearing, roughly 30 feet from where we stood, sat an ancient lean-to structure. It was constructed from heavy, decaying logs with bark peeling away like rotting skin. It had clearly been subjected to the elements for decades. The roof pieces were completely carpeted in thick, vibrant green moss. And there, sitting directly against the front of the structure with his back pressed hard against the decaying wood and his legs extended straight out into the dirt, was our missing hunter. To maintain focus on the true anomaly of that night, I will summarize the extraction quickly. He was alive, though severely dehydrated and weak. On his second day out, he had suffered a catastrophic knee injury, rendering him entirely unable to walk. He had managed to crawl into the shelter of the lean-to and simply waited. Though gaunt and battered by the elements, he was fundamentally intact. We ultimately evacuated him, and he returned safely to his family. That is the conventional, fortunate resolution to the search, and I am deeply grateful for it. What haunts me to this day is what transpired during the 40 agonizing minutes we spent waiting for the heavy litter team to navigate the terrain and reach our position. As we sat with him in that damp, darkening clearing, administering basic first aid and hydration, the hunter remained entirely lucid. I want to emphasize that point. He was not delirious. He was not hallucinating from fever or starvation. He was an incredibly stoic, grounded man who had survived combat in his youth. He was frightened, certainly, but his mind was sharp, and he answered our diagnostic questions with absolute clarity. As the shadows lengthened across the clearing, he began to speak in a flat, chillingly matter-of-fact tone. He told us that he had not been alone in that clearing. He explained that on his very first night in the woods, long after the sun had completely vanished, something massive had emerged from the blackness of the drainage, walked into the clearing, and sat down in the dirt, directly in the exact spot where Dee and I were currently sitting. The hunter told us he couldn't see the entity, but that did not mean he couldn't perceive it with absolute certainty. He whispered that when you spend 60 years hunting the deep ridges of Appalachia, you learn to inherently understand the profound difference between an empty darkness and a darkness that possesses a deliberate, living presence. And that night, the darkness was occupied. According to his account, the presence sat there through the entirety of the night. It did not shift. It did not pace. It made absolutely no physical sound. Eventually, overwhelmed by the suffocating terror of sitting alone in the pitch black with a broken leg, the hunter began to speak to it. He figured that speaking out loud was better than letting the silence drive him mad. He told the dark good evening. He explained aloud that he was severely injured, that a rescue team would eventually come looking for him, and that he meant no harm or threat to whatever shared the woods with him. The entity offered no response. It simply remained seated in the blackness, watching him. The hunter eventually drifted into an exhausted sleep, and when the first grey light of dawn broke through the canopy, the presence had vanished. On the second night, the exact same sequence occurred. The moment the pitch black settled over the Laurel hell, the entity returned, reclaiming its position at the edge of the clearing. Once again, the hunter spoke to it. By that second night, however, a bizarre psychological shift had occurred. His terror had given way to a strange sense of comfort. In the absence of human contact, this silent, unseen watcher began to feel like company rather than a mortal threat. It was the only other living thing that had chosen to stay with him in the wilderness, and he admitted he felt a genuine sense of gratitude toward it. The third night was the evening we arrived. The hunter noted that the presence had not returned before our headlamps cut through the brush. He stated, with the casual tone of someone reporting the daily weather, that he believed the entity knew we were coming and had intentionally vacated the area. What completely unnerved me, and what has kept me awake for years since, was the utter lack of sensationalism in his voice. Over my 11 years in search and rescue, I have interviewed dozens of traumatized, lost, and distressed individuals. I have trained myself to spot the telltale signs of delirium, exaggeration, and psychological fracturing. This man was not embellishing. He recounted the presence with the exact same emotional register, vocabulary, and directness that he used to describe his torn ligaments, his dwindling rations, and the mechanics of his injury. As we prepared the litter for transport, Dee caught my eye. On the long, quiet hike down the mountain later that night, she admitted to me in a whisper that she believed every single word he said. And Dee was, without exception, the most cynical, hard-nosed skeptic on our entire rescue squad. Right before we loaded the hunter onto the rescue litter, a nagging curiosity compelled me to ask him one final question. I asked him about the origin of the lean-to. I wanted to know if he had managed to construct it himself despite his shattered knee, or if it was an existing structure. He looked at me, his eyes dead serious, and explained that he had stumbled upon it in the dark while desperately trying to crawl out of a sudden torrential downpour on his first night. Then, he uttered something that sent a physical chill down my spine. He said that on the morning following his first night, when the bright daylight finally illuminated the clearing, he examined the engineering of the lean-to more closely. The timbers utilized in its construction were impossibly old. The wood had transformed into a pale, petrified silver, worn incredibly hard by centuries of exposure. More importantly, he noted the joinery. The logs had been notched and felled using tool marks he had never seen in his entire life. The man had worked as a professional, high-end master carpenter for 30 years. He knew every axe strike, every saw pattern, and every modern tool metric in existence. He looked me dead in the eye and said he had absolutely no idea what kind of implement had cut those logs. The lean-to had been standing in that suffocating Laurel drainage far longer than any living generation of human beings. And whatever had crawled out of the brush to sit with him in the dead of night, occupying the exact patch of dirt where we had laid our medical gear, had been bound to that ancient structure since long before our ancestors ever set foot on the ridge. I do not know what watched over that man. I don't know if it was an animal exhibiting completely unprecedented behavioral patterns, or something ancient that defies the classifications of modern biology. All I know is that as we wheeled the litter away from the clearing, the old hunter turned his head back toward the decaying shelter. He looked into the empty, darkening woods, and in a loud, clear voice, he said, "Thank you."